Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us today. Welcome to today's webinar. Today's talk is entitled Socrates, Standard of Care Randomized Trials and the Need for Big Randomized Data. My name is Kelsey Brown, and I am the Medical Writing Manager at TransPerfect Life Sciences, located in London. And it's my absolute pleasure today to moderate your session. And today's event will run for approximately 60 minutes, so we'll have a Q&A session at the very end. This session is designed to be interactive, so it works best when you're involved. So feel free throughout the course of the talk to submit your questions, any comments that you have for our speaker by using that questions panel in your chat box. And then we'll answer your questions during the Q&A session at the very end. If you need any help at any time, if you require assistance, just contact me with that chat box that you have that's also located in your control panel. At this time, everyone, all of our participants, they're in listen-only mode. And just a quick note, this session will be recorded, and so you'll have it available to you later on the IDDI website for viewing about 24 hours after the webinar has been completed. All right. Today's event is proudly sponsored or hosted by the International Drug Development Institute, IDDI. IDDI is an expert center in biostatistical and integrated e-clinical services for pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies in several disease areas, including oncology and ophthalmology. IDDI optimizes the clinical development of drugs, biologics, and devices thanks to proven statistical expertise and operational excellence. Founded in 1991, IDDI is headquartered near Brussels, Belgium, with a U.S. Center of Operations in Raleigh, North Carolina. So with that, I'm going to pass the ball over to Dr. Everardo Saad for introductions.
Thanks, Kelsey. Hello to everyone. Thank you for attending this webinar. On behalf of IDDI, it is really my pleasure to introduce the next in this series of webinars by invited speakers from around the world. And I really mean it, literally, because our guest today comes from Australia. By the way, this is why we're having this webinar earlier than usual, and we hope that our North America and South America viewers can catch up with the presentation that will be recorded. Professor John Symes is the founding director of the Clinical Trial Center and a senior principal research fellow at the National Health and Medical Research Council, better known as NHMRC, at the University of Sydney, Australia. He is also a professor of clinical epidemiology at the Faculty of Medicine of the same university, as well as a practicing medical oncologist with a focus on neuro-oncology. He's been involved in over 120 clinical trials in cancer, cardiovascular disease, and neonatal medicine. As some of you may know, due to the pandemic, we had to cancel a whole day event that was planned for April of last year. And Professor Symes was one of the keynote speakers at that event. And this was the topic of his presentation at the time. So today it's really our privilege to have him finally speak to us on this topic. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Everardo. And can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
And also, I just want to check that the slides are working okay. You can see the second slide in the series there of background.
Nope, you just need to share them. So
Good. So what I'm delighted to be able to talk to you all today about Socrates, a proposal for trying to make. Yes?
We can't see your presentation. I think you just need to share it.
Oh, there you go. Showing now?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Excellent. So I'm delighted to be able to talk to you all today about Socrates, a proposal to try to make randomization a more routine part of evaluating standard of care in the real world. As we know, many interventions that are used in everyday practice are not based on reliable evidence of effectiveness. And several interventions where there is evidence of effectiveness are still not widely used in clinical practice, either because the evidence that we have is not applied or because the evidence is not considered applicable in terms of the patients that you have in front of you, in terms of they're not meeting those eligibility or being treated in a different setting. So barriers to undertake clinical trials and to improve the amount of randomized evidence is important to try to have better evidence available for comparative effectiveness. And those barriers relate to the costs, the regulatory barriers and ethics, and a range of other things to undertake randomized trials more routinely. Many treatments, therefore, that we use from day to day are based on observational rather than randomized data. One solution to this has been talked about is making better use of big data in healthcare, where we take all the information available, whether it's from omics, the electronic record, clinical data, and use all that information to come up with, analyze in a smarter way to make then smarter and cost-effective decisions. And so a learning healthcare system based on analysis of big data is a proposal that might see improvements in healthcare. But the issue is, might this also be leading to false hope? We can look at the big data and drill down into it in a lot of ways in terms of the genomics, proteomics, metabolomics, etc. And this particularly is the case in cancer, where a lot of these things might be help to guide targeted therapies and other things like that. But that data could be integrated with healthcare analytics in terms of the record, clinical information, etc., and integrated to try to come up with what might be the best treatment for individual patients. So is this the way of the future, or is randomization still going to be an important part? Well, I'll argue that the need for large randomized trials is still needed to be able to demonstrate moderate treatment effects, and that this is still going to be needed in the era of targeted or personalized therapies. Interrogation of big data with artificial intelligence and other approaches is valuable, but will still be suboptimal if it's purely observational data. If I go back to some earlier studies, we can see in the oncology area, when we looked at various treatments, new treatments that were put to the test in randomized trials over a 50-year period, looking at NCI-sponsored phase 3 trials, on average, those treatments did about as well as the old treatments. So half the time they did better, half the time they did worse. And that if we had relied upon the earlier observational data, half the time we would have proven wrong. And the way we've made advances with those treatments is by undertaking large enough randomized trials to provide more reliable evidence so that the true advances can be adopted in terms of the treatments on the left, but those turning out to be the same or no better than the new ones would not have been introduced. So clinical trials, randomized trials, were important for those studies to distinguish real advances in cancer care from false hope. A number of other cohorts of randomized trials have been looked at in this Cochrane review, which looked at 4 cohorts, including the one I've just shown you of the NCI, but 3 others with similar findings. On average, the new treatments were slightly better than the old treatments, but there was a big overlap here, so that often the new treatments were no better or worse than the old treatments. And if we relied upon the earlier data, we would have concluded, often we would have introduced new treatments without this evidence, which would not have led to advances. So the randomized trials is an important part here of the overall strategy to see improvements in healthcare. What about in the area of more personalized medicine or targeted therapies in anti-cancer trials? We've done a similar exercise here, looking at novel therapies compared with standard therapies in cancer, where treatments are often selected on the basis of a more targeted approach. And this looks at a whole range of these randomized, when put to the test in randomized trials, that for the hazard ratio for progression-free survival, there does appear to be a moderate advantage of the new treatments. In terms of overall survival, less so. And this is when looking at all of those novel or targeted therapies. If one looks at that subset of those studies, which were where the patients were selected based on a biomarker selected population, we've done a little bit better there. You can see that more often than not, the trials were significant for their primary outcome, but still several studies which were not when put to the test in randomized trials. And in terms of a benefit for overall survival, again, a considerable overlap where more often the new treatments appear to be better, but a substantial minority where the new treatment was not better. So the randomized trials, even in the area of targeted therapies, was still of value to work out the true advances. An idealized model for improving healthcare then is to look at clinical trials and those randomized studies to generate the evidence to see that then leads to improvements in healthcare by undertaken, and then monitor the results of that through clinical quality registries to see to what extent those treatments are being applied in practice, but to look at the gaps in that evidence and the variations in care to drive the next set of unanswered questions in terms of generating further randomized evidence. So the randomized trials are of value in providing the least biased estimates of treatment effects and using that information to update systematic reviews of the trial evidence to provide reliable and unbiased evidence to inform practice and policy. So I'd argue, therefore, being able to undertake randomized studies more often would be a benefit to us in terms of advancing healthcare, both not only in the past, but in a more modern era of more novel therapies. So how can we make randomization of standard of care options a routine part and have a world where the analysis of big data not only includes the observational data, but also randomized evidence? So the particular concept I'm going to put forward today is the idea of the SOCRATES trial, or standard of care randomized trials for enhancing science of medicine. Socrates, a Greek philosopher from 400 BC, said, "True wisdom comes to each of us when we realize how little we understand about life, ourselves, and the world around us." So he would have, I'm sure, espoused the idea that getting better evidence to address questions, whether they're medical or otherwise, would be of value. Socrates is a very simple idea, although quite radical in the sense of the way we conventionally do randomized trials, and has 3 or 4 basic elements. The first is that we have 2 or more standard of care protocols or evidence-based guidelines, which are registered with a responsible institution that we'd like to consider for a patient that has been considered for particular treatment. Then both the doctor responsible for the care of the patient and the patient themselves do not have a clear preference for either of those standard of care options, and therefore will be willing to receive either of them. And the 4th criteria is that the patient is agreeable to have their information, that they basically will consent to the treatment options, as well as have their information in a de-identified way of clinical follow-up collected for the trial. Essentially, that's it in terms of the study proposal, and that rather than then putting all the detailed elements of the protocol to an ethics committee for review, the ethics committee is approving this overall umbrella or platform concept. So the standard of care protocols and the guidelines remain the responsibility of the hospital or institution and the doctor providing the care, as would happen for usual clinical practice. So the Socrates protocol does not need to contain the standard care protocols themselves, but rather the basic framework that I've just outlined. We are about to undertake a Socrates pilot protocol that will, though, contain an appendix of specific treatment protocols, but in the long-term aim is that each of those is really up to the doctor looking after the patient to say, yes, there are 2 or more standard of care treatments available for this patient, which are recognized at their institution, which would be valid treatments to give. So the kind of ethical issues that this arises then is that what we're looking at here is trying to really mirror what happens for routine clinical practice. So the process of consent and participation would be the same as if you were giving those same treatments outside a trial. Informed consent, therefore, is for the randomized treatments, both of those options, as well as collecting some de-identified data in terms of some simple outcomes from the patient's record. And the proposal is also suggesting collecting some simple patient-reported outcomes, although that would be an option, not necessarily required all the time. There are no additional tests or monitoring undertaken. Whatever tests are needed to provide that standard of care, be they x-rays or blood tests to see how the patient's responding to therapy, what's happening to their disease, those same tests would be undertaken. But there's not additional tests done for the purpose of the trial. So this is somewhat analogous to what you would do if you're undertaking a clinical audit of routine care, where you go through the patient medical record, see how the patient was responded to their therapy, whether they had adverse events, etc. But it would be done in the context of what's routinely collected in the medical record. There'd be no additional requirements, therefore, for adverse event reporting. If the patient had an adverse event report that was thought related to a study drug, such that there was an SADR that you'd be obligated to report to regulatory authorities, you do the same here. But above and beyond that, there would not be the collection of SAEs as would happen in most clinical trials, because this would be trying to mirror what happens in routine practice. The consent form is a little bit different than the usual consent form. It would list all the general criteria for undertaking clinical trials. It then requires the doctor to actually list on the consent form what the patient's condition is, as well as the proposed treatment options. So they'd be entered on the form. That the patient's information would be outlined in general terms about rights to withdraw from treatments and all the things which should be part of routine clinical practice as well as any clinical trial. All the specific side effects, the treatment goals and other options should be provided as they would normally be for routine clinical practice. So they would not be indicated on the consent form, but they would clearly need to be discussed with the patient as you would do if the patient wasn't in a clinical trial. There'll be some additional areas on the consent form, though, related to ensuring any information collected was maintained confidentially and that privacy was protected and only de-identified data was used in any reports. There are a number of legal and indemnity issues that would come up in relation to this proposal. And the basic responsibility of the care of the patient would remain with the clinician and their appropriate institution, as would be the case for any routine clinical practice. So that if there was a problem in relation to inadequate consent or an adverse effect of therapy, the same responsibilities would rest with that clinician as would be the case if they were not in a clinical trial. There are two potential minor areas of additional risk beyond the standard of care management. One of them would relate to a breach of patient confidentiality if, in fact, some of the information related to their identity was covered, but provided those things are set up appropriately, that would be a very small risk and should be managed appropriately. The second is that it's important that the treatments the patients are receiving are still ones for which there is sufficient uncertainty that either of them would be appropriate. So that if we're generating new evidence from this randomized trial, just like any other, we'd want to make sure that information was available so that clinicians would be able to base their decisions on up-to-date evidence-based protocols. So this means that one of the corollaries of this, therefore, is we need a reliable system for ensuring the sufficient uptake of any new trial evidence generated. So data collection, analysis and updating trial evidence, therefore, is an important part of this proposal. This is suggested would happen in two ways. One is to have a very simple web-based centralized database where the primary clinician would be responsible for providing a simplified data record. This would contain the patient and disease descriptors sufficient to justify classifying the patient to being eligible for those particular protocols. And as I said before, the responsibility to say that those are appropriate for that patient would rest with the clinician, just that like it would if they were having those treatments outside a trial. Simple baseline risk factor information would be collected, as well as the proposed treatment details, and then details of the standard of care protocols, the treatments given, and then some simple clinical outcome information, which again would be according to what would normally be collected to determine if that patient was responding or not to the treatment. So some measures of response to treatment, progression of their disease, overall survival, as well as any major adverse, any adverse events thought related to treatment. There'd also be the option of additional patient-reported outcomes using a web-based tool for a PRO. The proposal would be to collect data at minimal time points, baseline, the completion of protocol therapy, and perhaps annually, but it's trying to keep this to make it pragmatic in a fairly simple way. And then there'd be the ability, if the option of potentially collecting other data from central databases as well. I'll come back to the idea of embedding that randomized treatments, though, in the patient's record down the track. So in terms of the trial design, most clinical trials are traditionally designed with a predefined sample size or a planned number of events so that we can provide reliable evidence of a treatment effect. You'd have an independent safety and data monitoring committee reviewing interim data at planned intervals to see whether there was clear evidence of benefit or harm, and if the question was answered, stop the trial at that time. In contrast to the SOCRATES trial program, there would not be pre-planned size for these studies because you're looking at a whole range of questions with a moderately small number of patients contributing to each over time. But rather, you'd be trying to update the data on a regular basis. For example, after 50 new events or new patients were recruited to each question, and provide a regular update. And you'd need to have a process where that information was also incorporated into evidence-based guidelines, which or evidence databases, which I'll come back to. So provided that data is being used in a way to update publicly accessible databases for systematic reviewers of randomized trials to be able to undertake, then that will still be able to inform future clinical practice. But it's not going to be able to do it in the way of having a discrete clinical trial where one's answered a question, although that is something one could discuss. An IDSMC would provide oversight of the overall program to ensure the data is being generated, is being used to update things in a responsible way. So where does this fit into with the so-called living evidence guidelines, which are being set up within the Cochrane collaboration and other ways to ensure that when systematic reviews of trials are undertaken, they're done in a way which will not only look at each time every 5 years or so and see what's going on, but done in a much more rapid way as new evidence is generated. So hopefully in the future we'll see a world where updates from individual trials as they're published, but also from this kind of information can be used to update information and provide that in more real time back to future clinical decisions. That's important for two things. One is to just advise what should be the evidence-based care for patients in the real world outside a trial, but also can be used to say, what are the still unanswered questions, which could be ways of identifying what are the questions which could be used within the SOCRATES protocol. So SOCRATES hopefully will be able to help living evidence guidelines, as I say, in two ways. One is to provide additional evidence, which can be incorporated into those guidelines. But secondly, have those guidelines become an excellent source for identifying what are the important unanswered questions. Now, this, as I said, this is a fairly radical proposal, and I think it requires thinking not just what would happen in the next few years, what might be happening over a much longer period of time, but one could imagine that if this did become a reality, that we could see this being a more seamless way that we are undertaking randomization and seeing it being used to update evidence-based guidelines. But there are several other ways that we should be looking at of trying to improve the amount of randomized evidence in the real world. And many of those, and I'm sure there's other talks in relation to this as well for this series, one of them relates to the use of randomization as a more routine part of comparative effectiveness research, of which I'd regard this as one example. Clustered randomized trials where one's not randomizing the individual patient, but healthcare units or other settings also is a practical way that I think there's value in seeing much more of that. The use of registry-based trials where we have clinical quality registries collecting information to ensure evidence-based care is being adopted as much as possible in the real world, but also where that can be used as a platform for undertaking randomized trials is something which is being used more often, and I would argue would be useful to do much more of. Other platform trials which may not be linked to a registry are also worth undertaking more of as well. And a greater use of consent waiver or opt-out consent where sometimes to get more randomization, the consent process itself for emergency treatments is something which we need to consider having flexibility in. The model that I've outlined here, though, would not have consent waiver in this situation. So those are strategies which would be in addition to or different from the SOCRATES model I've just outlined. Let's just look at a couple of examples in relation to some of those other ones I've just mentioned. So one is in relation to registry-based trials. This is an example of using the Swedish registry of coronary angiography and angioplasty registry, the SCAR registry, as a platform for undertaking relatively cheaply additional treatments. So this particular study, the TASTE trial, compared a new treatment, which was thrombus aspiration, so actually trying to suck the thrombus out of the coronary artery, compared with a standard PCI or undertaking an angioplasty, to see whether that additional treatment might provide better outcomes for patients. And using the registry where they were able to randomize over 7,000 patients relatively simply, and all the outcome information was being collected in the study as part of the registry. So it was a relatively inexpensive exercise, and the result showed no significant difference in terms of mortality outcomes, so that it was a treatment that was not supported based on this particular simple approach. And being able to undertake these things like that is clearly one method that we could see more of. Another one in relation to using a registry which deals with some of the issues of informed consent is the Dutch colorectal cancer cohort. What they've done here is to enroll a whole lot of patients with colorectal cancer in a series of observational data, collecting information as part of a registry. And then within that, up front, getting informed consent from patients to take part in future randomizations to other treatments on top of their standard of care approach. So everybody gets consented up front. And then for a particular novel intervention down the track, that subset of patients that would be eligible for it, half of them can be randomized and approached for the new intervention. And they are then consented again to say, would you be happy to have this new treatment? And the other half are not randomized again. They simply continue to be followed as part of the registry. And so all that information is used for the control group. The patients that agree to, the patients that are approached for the new treatment, if they decide they don't want to have it, just to have the standard of care, they'll still be analysed in intention to treat in that intervention group. So that's a very practical way of being able to enrol patients and deal with some of the consent issue, and that's, I believe, worked well in terms of being able to enrol for a number of interventions in a practical way. The third example I'd like to give is the recovery trial, which is a platform trial in the era of COVID undertaken in the United Kingdom, looking at a whole range of treatments. A study that was set up very quickly in response to the pandemic and is using, as patients come in, were enrolled into a number of treatments. No additional treatment apart from standard care or other therapies, including hydroxychloroquine, that a former president in the US thought might be worthwhile, as well as dexamethasone. Now, in terms of those treatments, it turned out that the hydroxychloroquine had no advantage in terms of reducing mortality amongst 1,500 patients that were hospitalized, whereas the dexamethasone did show a survival benefit, particularly amongst the patients that required more oxygen or admitted to ICU. And that treatment, the dexamethasone, is now part of standard of care for such patients in hospital, whereas the hydroxychloroquine is not. So a demonstration practically that this kind of platform trial, where this study was able to introduce new treatments and drop ones not effective, is a great way to try to get better randomized evidence to inform routine practice. The fourth example I'd like to give is the consent waiver for acute management of oxygen therapy, oxygen delivery for preterm infants. We've been involved in studies looking at, after going to the neonatal, the NICU, whether to give targeted oxygen at higher or lower levels, and showed that there's a mortality benefit of the group assigned at the higher oxygen saturation level. This is a follow-on question for that. At the time, immediately after delivery, whether you start giving the oxygen to the preterm baby at a rate of 60% or 30% FiO2, and and then you continue to adjust it after that back to achieve an oxygen saturation target in a range of usually 90 to 95% oxygen saturation. So both of these starting points of 0.3 or 0.6 are considered standard of care in neonatal in the delivery room in different places around the world. The opportunity to actually undertake informed consent during delivery is obviously very difficult, because a woman's in pain from labour, etc., and it's not an easy conversation to have. And getting consent prior to going into labour also means that which has been done as part of this trial, by the way, is also problematic in terms of needing to get consent for a far larger number than actually go on to the study. So this was being discussed with the lead ethics committee in Australia and the consumer groups, and felt that this was a situation that getting a waiver for initial consent was perfectly appropriate, and then getting subsequent consent to continue follow-up after that initial delivery is the way the study's been done. So looking at consent waiver or opt-out consent approaches for a number of studies is another strategy that will be legitimate in some circumstances to increase the use of randomization to inform what should be standard of care. What might the ideal future look like? And I'm not giving a short time frame for this. I'm thinking because this strategy is not something we need to have solved in the next 5 years. If I'm thinking in 50 years' time, for example, when we'll have even better use of the use of digital health records, etc., I would like to think of a world where a much more routine use of embedding randomized healthcare decisions is the way we can practice medicine. And I'd like to see that happening in a number of ways. One of them is that the use of big data, as I talked about at the beginning of this discussion, was something which can be used to guide clinical practice and therapeutic decision making. And it will help us in terms of making personalized decisions, which can be linked to specific biomarkers, genomic or molecular profiles for patients or other information. And we can also try to see how we can use data mining of multiple health records in a better way. but that information will be limited if, still, unless we can also have one additional important variable within that big data, which is, imagine that often every time somebody is getting a treatment, there is another treatment that they could have had, which they were randomized, they got randomized to one but not the other. And we use that additional information within the interrogation of that big data to provide additional controls to be able to adjust those estimates and come up with a less biased estimate of that treatment effect. The other way that I would like to see things happening in the future is a much greater use of the regular updates of the clinical trial evidence, which will both provide clinical protocols which can help therefore inform decision making, but also can be providing the information needed to help inform what the future, the unanswered questions are, that we can continue to use that as a virtual cycle for driving better quality care. I'm just going to go over to some of the things, and we're happy to explore these in more detail in the question and answers in a moment. What are some of the problems with the SOCRATES thing, or some of the ways that it may or may not work? So some of the questions that I and my colleagues have posed is that doctors and patients may just simply not want to take part in such randomized trials. Particularly, they may have concerns about whether their usual care they give, if it's all registered as part of the trial, will be more open to scrutiny. And so there will be concerns about whether they'll wish to take part in this or just find it easier to have those conversations with the patient and not shared elsewhere. Regulatory bodies traditionally want to see a lot of safety information coming out of clinical trials. And so the idea that adverse event reporting, beyond what we collect in we decide as information to collect within the trial its outcomes, is something which would not be collected as part of this, although would still be available within the big data set, so you'd still be able to scrutinize it at that level. Only minor variations in healthcare might be examined. If the only questions we ever look at are the ones which is really giving, for example, 4 cycles versus 5 cycles of a particular form of chemotherapy for cancer, well then that's really not going to be sufficiently different to ever generate something which will show a difference. And if we ask so many different questions, we may never have enough information on any single question to be able to provide reliable answers. So will the quality of the data be too poor to be of value? So those are legitimate questions which we can discuss. If the evidence that we generate is never properly collected and added to evidence-based guidelines, then again, that would also question the ethics of doing it in the first place. And as I've outlined other models for collecting randomized comparative effectiveness, this still has limitations even in the way it's been done. So this is not a substitute for all those other randomized trials, but something which would complement them. So I just thought I'd give you a couple more things therefore on a couple of those questions. So in terms of ensuring people do feel it's worth taking part, if we have an independent endorsement of the overall program, if we're using recognized standard of care protocols, and if the unanswered questions become more routinely registered as well, then I think that will give people a sense of confidence to take part. But additional ways would be to make this part of the participation in randomized trials of standard of care become a part of your delivery of quality healthcare and seen as part of your, just like you need to take part in clinical audits as part of delivering clinical care, that you'd need to do that also. You could see this as a way of demonstrating you are participating in quality care, but also making sure there are resources available for the time involved. I'll just go to one last slide about one of those questions, which is the data being of poor, not being of adequate quality. I think here that does require a sophisticated web-based system for people to be able to enter information. It will require the clinicians involved to actually be registered. So you'd still need to, even though you wouldn't be you'd still be, that person would need to be signing up to be part of the program, so you can go back and still get information from them about their individual patients. And that you'd still want to have some standardized outcomes for certain things which we'd still need to develop. But as I said at the beginning, recently, I think the idea that embedding this in the patient record as well, where the control group was not allocated, is also part of that record, would be a way to ensure that that big data becomes of value in the future. And at that, I will stop and happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Symes. And yeah, Everardo, thank you for joining us again. Excellent presentation, Professor Symes. It was really, really great. And I hope everyone in the audience enjoyed this as well. Just a quick reminder, we're going to go into the Q&A session, but I wanted to remind everyone in the audience that you can still submit questions in the questions panel. So just pop those in and we'll try to get to as many as we can.
Thanks, Kelsey. John, thank you very much. This is a great idea, I think. While people send their questions in, I have some questions myself. It's not clear to me, what is the state of implementation at this point? Do you already have some studies running, or this is still in planning stages?
It's still in planning stages, but we have discussed it with the ethics committee chair and with consumer groups. We are in the process. We thought, rather than going for the full deal, as it were, in terms of allowing any intervention, what we're planning to do is, as the first pilot phase, is to actually restrict it to a number of set sites and a number of particular interventions. So we're looking at doing it for a number of cancer protocols as well as cardiovascular, where within that setting, we're going to have an appendix of what those particular protocols are. And the aim of that will be to collect information on about 150 patients in the initial stage of just their experiences of taking part in the SOCRATES model. So we'll be collecting information on they'll still be using the form, therefore, of completing what the doctor feels are the standard care options for them, what their condition is, and things of that nature. So we'll be testing the logistics of it as well as the experience, and so we won't have enough information for those initial patients for any individual question, and we'll see how that goes in terms of that experience to then widen it more broadly. I think there's some. It's unclear to me still whether the more radical side of it, of just allowing any treatment question for anything anywhere in the world to be part of this, versus it's still always going to have some containment to particular centers, particular doctors, and a particular subset of protocols. I think it's probably going to be the former. But I think one of the values of this will also be that if we can demonstrate this works, it provides a way to open up randomization much more than if we're limiting it each time to have to submit a full protocol each time to your ethics committee.
Right. Okay. I have another question. I'm thinking as an oncologist, how do you deal with, or how do you plan to deal with the assessment of efficacy endpoints that require a lot of standardization, for example, RECIST or variations, or even progression-free survival? How do you plan to deal with that?
Yeah, so I think in relation to the information which is collected on the web-based system, we would not be, if somebody would not be routinely collecting RECIST for their standard of care, then we can't be asking for that as part of a trial outcome. We'd be asking them to be documenting the response to treatment exactly the way they would in their usual practice. So at our site, for where we practice oncology, then we would be usually recording in the medical record response according to RECIST criteria. But for pragmatic reasons, if we had not elected to do the scans as often for that particular patient, well, then that's what we'll have available. So that's what we'd be proposing to do here. When I come back to having that also embedded in the medical record, if somebody was interrogating big data down the track, and they were, as part of that normally observational data, would have been trying to assess RECIST criteria. Well, they can do the same thing there as well if that information was available.
Right. So it's very pragmatic, right?
Correct.
Very, yeah. I have another question of my own. How strict do you think the protocols will be with regard to eligibility criteria? For example, if there's a spectrum from very strict, in pivotal clinical trials to, let's say very flexible in real life, where are you going to be positioned along that spectrum?
So
Will there
there's
be
no
requirement?
No. I think what's important is to try to collect some information, though, as to what extent these patients would be eligible for other trials. But here, the criteria as to whether they can have particular standard of care is in the judgment of the clinician and the patient that treatment is suitable for them. So if you have somebody, for example, where the guideline, but it also comes back to the guideline. If the guideline makes it clear that this treatment is for somebody, for example, with normal renal function and normal liver function, then that standard of care, whereas outside that it's considered not a standard of care, well, then that would not be able to be given part of the randomized study. So it's where it would have to meet whatever the criteria are for that hospital-based protocol or for that guideline, is to say, yes, the criteria to give that treatment as a standard of care are being met. But the corollary to that then is that since that it's quite broad like that, is to still have collection of some information so that when you're interrogating the data later, you'll know that, for example, that somebody was already in renal failure or whatever,
Right.
that you decided to give a treatment to. So you'll still need to be collecting some of those baseline data as well.
Okay, good. I have a question from one of our viewers. They say, thank you for the great presentation. The proposal seems to apply more to the activities post-regulatory approval, health technology assessment. Do you see potential application at a regulatory level? If I understand correctly, can this evidence be used for regulatory submission? That's my translation of the question.
Yes, I think probably not. I mean, I think that for regulatory, for a treatment which does not yet have an approved indication, then I don't think it can be seen as part of a standard of care. And I think additional requirements for such treatments, particularly in relation to collecting safety information on adverse events, etc., I think should still be part of such studies. Whether there is the opportunity to have some in-between things, so not applying everything which was in SOCRATES, but still allowing some relaxation for more pragmatic studies, I think that's certainly worth doing. And having a tiered approach for studies which do require for regulatory approval, which might be in different settings, would still be worthwhile. So we're, for example, doing a trial at the moment looking at aspirin for preventing, in the context of trying to prevent recurrence for colorectal cancer as part of an international study. It's not approved for that indication, so it's not a standard of care for that particular treatment, and therefore it would still fall outside the guidelines we have here. But nevertheless, you would argue that such a trial should be very simple and it should not require the level of adverse event reporting, since the knowledge we have about aspirin causing adverse event is very well known. So you'd like to think it could be much simpler than what might be the case for a treatment that had not been had the same level of information available.
Right. And a related question, I think you touched briefly on it in one of your last slides, but do you expect the results of some of the trials to change the institutional guidelines?
Yes, look, I think in the short term, the amount of evidence it's going to generate will be relatively modest, and I think it can add somewhat to the total database, but there's still going to be quite a bit of evidence coming from other areas. Perhaps the main way it's probably going to help in relation to changing practice will be when you're looking at you'll have evidence which you're trying to extend the evidence base. So people, for example, you say, look, the standard of care could apply in the setting, take the elderly, for example, but nevertheless, a lot of people aren't using it. And we generate evidence which is consistent with the evidence in the younger patients, and we're not seeing major problems in terms of adverse effects, etc. Then you could see a modest amount of extra evidence there leading to changes in practice by extending current evidence. If it's a particular, in terms of particularly new areas, I think it'll be other studies as well that it'll be adding to, rather than it'll be doing it in its own. In the longer term, I would like to think of this, that this has a great and enthusiastic uptake, that yes, you would like to see it doing exactly that. And if it doesn't do that in the longer term, you'd question the model.
Right. Okay. There's a more statistical question. How do you, well, if you can analyze results as you go, you said, for example, you gave the example of 50 patients or 50 events as, let's say, milestones for analysis. Is there a concern with, let's say, multiplicity issues, looking at the data multiple times, or how, let's say, a related question, how seriously will you take the statistical results as such, for example, as we do in pivotal studies?
Yeah, excellent question. So I think the problem of multiplicity is a real one. I think it's similar in some ways to what happens with a cumulative meta-analysis, where as you do new studies, and because I think this evidence will be adding to the existing evidence rather than there's already, if you've got two forms of standard care, there'll already be some evidence beforehand. So most of the situations here, I think, will be adding to evidence rather than by itself. But I think, therefore, I think there'll be some level of uncertainty. So you might say for certain things that there's still not enough evidence for this to be a slam dunk. In terms of, like, for example, you wouldn't want to just declare the evidence is clear cut if you had a p-value of 0.05. But I think different people will then look at the existing evidence and say, this is still uncertain, and you'll still be adding to it for some, but not others. I think in some ways, though, I'd be probably also looking at this more like just what the total evidence is from a Bayesian perspective, rather than a stopping rule for a trial, as a way of trying to sort of think about it. But yes, I think that is an issue that you could end up, just as you can outside the setting, when you're looking at all the evidence, draw conclusions which may be premature when you look at the early results that come in from some studies and others are ongoing.
Right. I have a couple more questions from the audience. This one is informed consent adjusted after each interim look? In other words, made public? Not in other words, this is in parentheses, made public, question mark, mentioning the most recent point estimates. So it's kind of related to the previous question.
So in terms of informed consent, I think the information on the particular trial would be, my view would be through trying to update the general evidence rather than just providing feedback on the interim results back to the patients in the study, particularly as the question that they were having at the time that they went onto the study will be not necessarily be relevant to their situation. So they might have been on treatment for 6 months. Is stopping that treatment is not the same as whether you started it, for example. But I think the ethical responsibility back to the patient is exactly the same as standard of care treatments in the real world. If you've started somebody on a standard of care treatment and they're not in a clinical trial, and new evidence emerges from whatever trial, which suggests they should no longer be on that treatment, then you'll discuss that with the patient as you would for the patient on this trial.
Okay. Very good. I'm just struggling here to read the questions. I think you you alluded to this. I mean, you try to preempt many of the objections, right, that you may face. Is in your last few slides, is that because you have already faced them? How do you think, you know, how difficult do you think it will be to implement this, let's say, across the board, you know, in a large country? How do you think this will be, you know, accepted by institutions? And, you know, have you had so far real objections, or are you just trying to preempt them with your you know, the questions that you brought at the end?
Yeah, very good. Look, I've had quite a wide range of comments, and I've presented this in other forums as well, including with consumer groups and others. Some people look at this saying that's not going to work because it's outside the way we normally think of clinical trials, and others think this is exactly what we should be doing. I think that the idea of doing, as I said, the full deal up front would be too much a departure from the conventional way of doing trials to get started, which is why we're looking at this pilot phase of restricting the study to a defined set of protocols, which would be in an appendix, and looking at that also being done within a more limited number of institutions at the first stage as well. Having done that, though, and I think the conversations we've had with ethics committees and with consumers is that that's likely to be approved and underway. And then I think after that, as to whether one's able to go the full way, or whether we need to still have some subset of questions, and whether it's always going to have an appendix of protocols, for example, is something which I think time will tell.
Okay, very good. I think we have time for a final question from the audience, and this is a very pragmatic one. How are projects like this funded?
Very good question. At the moment, we have a program grant from the National Health and Medical Research Council, which is supporting the initial pilot work of this. But I think if this is successful, then I would like to see that we might try to partner this with, for this to be, what I'd like is perhaps happen in two stages. The first stage is to demonstrate that the ethical and regulatory barriers to this can be dealt with, and that people can say, look, this is in principle something that's worth doing. The biggest challenge will be, can we make it work with some of the databases, the health record and things like that, so that we can actually get the information collected and synthesized in a meaningful way. And for that, I think partnership with others might be useful. So one conversation I'd like to have was with, for example, Google Health, as to whether if we can demonstrate that this is feasible from an ethics and regulatory perspective, that they might sort of embrace taking on something like this as well, and also have it part of living evidence-based guidelines, so that as the information is being generated, it's being made available. I think so. In the long term, I think partnerships like that would be useful. In the short term, we have a very modest amount of funding from our National Health and Medical Research Council.
Okay, thanks for your answers. Thank you very much for this presentation once again. I think I'll just hand it back to Kelsey. I don't know if she has final remarks.
Yeah, just a few housekeeping items, I think. So if we couldn't get to everyone's questions today, or if you still have questions that you'd like to ask, we will be following up with any outstanding questions. But if you have any furthers, you can direct them towards Dominique Grizzard at dominique.grizzard@iddi.com. So you'll be receiving a follow-up email from us with access to the recorded archive for this event, and then Dominique's email as well. But yeah, we thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. Professor Symes and Dr. Saad, thank you very, very much for speaking today and for the Q&A. I think that was everything from my end. There will be a survey as everyone's leaving the webinar, so we'd really appreciate if you could give your insights, and that helps us improve for future webinars. But thank you everyone for joining today. It's been lovely moderating with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kelsey.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, John.
Have a great day, everyone.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.